So, welcome everyone to the second ever World Youth Conference on Climate Change. My name is Edmund Yu, and I am one of the founding members of the Climate Change Task Force, which is the nonprofit organization holding our event today. Now, what is the Climate Change Task Force? Our organization consists of volunteers mainly from Southern Californian high schools, united in a fight for the environment. We aim not only to spread awareness on the growing impacts of climate change around the world, but also to propose real, viable solutions in political, social, and economic aspects of our society. The purpose of this conference today is to spread the message of the Climate Change Task Force globally and carry out our goals at an even larger scale. In our very first World Youth Conference on Climate Change in October of 2020, the focus of our climate change discussions was on the insurmountable number of impacts that global warming has had on our planet. The keynote speaker of that conference was Dr. Ian Fenty, a climate scientist from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He elaborated on the statistics of the Earth's rising sea levels and their devastating effects on the world's living organisms. Every speech in our first conference emphasized the necessity in finding solutions to climate change generated problems. Turning our attention to today, the objective of this conference is to discuss the effectiveness of current responses to climate change and propose future forms of action we can take in an effort to mitigate human caused environmental damage. Up on the screen is a picture of today's perspective schedule. Feel free to take a picture of it or write it down. Our first speech is by Charles from the Climate Change Task Force. He will be talking about the numerous effects that climate change has on human health. After this topic, Selena and Cindy of the Climate Change Task Force will be presenting next. They will be addressing current governmental climate policies in countries such as the United States, China, and India. Following their presentation, Maddie of Sunrise Montclair will be discussing the importance of mutual aid in the climate crisis movement. Finally, I will be finishing this conference with a speech on how to avoid a climate change disaster, specifically emphasizing certain technological advancements. Between each speech, there will be a 10-minute session where the audience can ask questions to our speakers about the topics they presented on. This time can also be used as a break before listening to the next presentations. Remember, our goal here today is to encourage discussion on climate change from people who live all around the world. We urge you to voice your opinion on anything you feel is important. So without further ado, it is time for our first presentation by Charles of the Climate Change Task Force. Again, he will be discussing the tremendous health harms of climate change, illustrating the necessity of environmental action. Please feel free to begin whenever you are ready, Charles.
Well, so let me just present my screen so we can begin. Now, I worked with a partner on this. I don't know if it was able to be relayed up the information so that it would be in your slides, but I did work with a partner and he'd like to present his first. So let me just share my screen and we can see this presentation. Okay. So the effects of climate change on human health. I worked with Bowen Deng, so he would like to do a couple of the first slides.
All right, to begin, we have to first define climate change. So what exactly is climate change? Now, climate change is changes in weather conditions that persist over multiple decades. Now, this can include increases or decreases in temperature. In our case, it's an increase, shift in precipitation patterns, and increasing intensity to natural disasters. Now, negative effects can vary across regions, but there are some constants. And human activity, such as burning fossil fuel and deforestation, has caused a jump in the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, leading to trapped heat and higher global temperatures. Now, here's a trend rather of rising temperatures in the United States if if we continue going as we are going now. From 30 years now, as you can see, temperature across the regions will have rise significantly. And 50 years later, there is an even more devastating change, as you can see here. Now, climate change also causes changes in precipitation, as we've established. And again, this is regional. In western states, precipitation, they may get less precipitation, but in northeastern states, there actually may be more. And again, these effects are exacerbated the longer this keeps going. Now, without climate protective measures, I can see the effects to global temperature will be devastating. And this lowest line over here is if we suddenly stop doing what we've been doing in the past couple of years or so. And ideally, we would never want the global temperature to go above an increase of 2 degrees Celsius. As established, the effects of climate change are different across regions of the United States. For example, in the Northeast, an increase in floods could threaten New England's industry and commerce along bodies of water, which would spread contaminants into soil and water, creating dangerous health conditions for the people living in these regions. Largest increases are in the Northeast. Now, in the West, there have been extreme and increasing temperatures. For example, Death Valley reached a temperature of 130 degrees Fahrenheit on August 6th of last year, a high not reached on Earth in 89 years. Temperatures in the state of California rose 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit since 1980. At current rates, temperatures will rise another 3 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050. And there has also been decreasing rainfall in the West, and participation in California has dropped 30% since 1980, leading to increased droughts. And these and many other factors have led to the severe wildfires of the past summer. Now, California and other Western states do have wildfires during the summer. However, their effects have been exacerbated by climate change. Now, climate change can also lead to cold waves, which are less frequent but more intense, and also more frequent and more intense winter storms. We just saw an example of this in Texas recently. Now, the Texas storm was an effect, but was an effect of climate change, as warming in the Arctic weakened the jet stream that keeps cold air deep in the northern hemisphere and allowed this cold air to drift down to lower latitudes, causing power outages and deaths to Texans. Now, the Texas power grid was unaccustomed to such changing conditions, failed, again, leaving many without power. There are various factors that went into the Texas power grid failing. However, climate change certainly must be considered.
All right, so the impacts on human health from climate change are numerous and various. So the first most important thing that one thinks of is the changes in weather patterns and global temperatures, and these have various effects on human health. Now, climate change tends to exacerbate existing health threats, and it creates new challenges. Some of these existing health threats that may be exacerbated can be exacerbated by elevated temperature, more frequent and more severe weather events, degraded air quality, and food, water, and vector-borne diseases. Now, extreme weather events are one of these, and they will be discussed later. And these impacts on human health tend to disproportionately affect certain groups. Those who have low income, so they don't have the disposable income to deal with such events, such as extreme weather events in the most devastating cases. They affect indigenous peoples disproportionately because they may not have the resources or the infrastructure to adapt to such changes, and those with chronic medical conditions. Now, here are some of the effects upon health visualized through a graph. For example, extreme heat with more frequent and prolonged heat illnesses, although this seems very obvious. Flooding and rising sea levels, heavier precipitation, all these effects correlated with flooding may cause contaminated water and debris to be strewn across various places that are not adapted to deal with such occurrences. This can cause various illness and disease that normally would not be localized to certain areas. And of course, you have vector-borne infectious diseases, which we're going to discuss in a minute. And the changing in patterns of weather may also affect the reproductive cycles of various vectors, among others. This can cause the spread of different diseases in seasons that normally would not experience these diseases in significant amounts. Now, there are other effects. For example, extreme weather events can cause the most obvious effects of climate change, such as injuries and fatalities, and mental health, such as PTSD. Heat stress can obviously cause heat-related illness. Air quality degradation can exacerbate asthma, an existing illness, and respiratory diseases that are affected by degraded air quality. Now, there are other effects such as food supply and food availability that are also altered by climate change. So we can take a look at that. There are some slides in there in a minute. And of course, vector distribution. So, for example, diseases. Now, vector-borne disease is one of the more important parts of these. So vector-borne diseases, these are spread by vectors such as mosquitoes, fleas, and ticks. And climate change is likely to affect disease transmission and infection patterns. What this means is that because of changes in climate, the optimal range for certain vectors of disease may become broader, may become localized to an area that was not previously prepared to deal with such diseases. So we can take a look at this graph the map in the corner. Changes in Lyme disease case report distribution. As you can see, in 2001, it was mostly localized to the coast here around New York and PA, although now, in 2014, much later, you can see that it has spread to areas that did not particularly experience significant Lyme disease cases. So this is one example of how changing the conditions, environmental conditions of certain areas may lead to vector new selective pressures provided by climate change, such as more damp environment, may cause evolution in certain vectors that may spread different diseases. And one of the more important things to remember is that it is difficult to predict the exact effects of such of climate change on these diseases, but they are certain to change as the climate changes. Now, there are also diseases related to water. And because climate change is expected to increase people's exposure to waterborne contaminants and toxins due to flooding or increased precipitation, climate change-related factors then may affect prevalence of water-related illness, of course. So we can take a look here. You may experience algal blooms due to higher precipitation. These can have varied effects on local populations, which we'll get to in a couple slides. Now, climate change can also affect food security. Now, climate change is likely to affect global and local food security by disrupting food availability. Now, increase in carbon dioxide, one of the ways that global warming takes place, can affect food security in two major ways. One that seems very obvious and one that is less obvious. Now, rising global temperatures and extreme weather events may have consequences in terms of food spoilage, contamination, and distribution. Now, this seems very clear, as extreme weather events may disrupt food supply lines, disrupt farms and agriculture. But however, there's another effect from rising CO2 levels. They have been shown to stimulate growth and carbohydrate production in some plants, but they also tend to reduce the amount of essential minerals and proteins produced in some crop plants. What this means is that crop plants are likely to get less nutritious, requiring new ways to adapt to such changes. Now, various factors in food processing and distribution may be affected in several ways. Higher temperatures may increase the pathogen levels in food because pathogens may grow at a higher optimal temperature that is now easily reached. Environmental condition changes may increase heavy metal levels in food supply because a disruption in environment may increased heavy metal levels in the ground and in the soil. Now, extreme weather events, the most obvious of the effects of climate change. Climate projections indicate that occurrence and severity of extreme weather events will increase. Now, extreme weather events have health effects like death and injury. And to prepare for or deal with the effects of such weather events, say tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, may also have health impacts such as post-event cleanup. Dealing with floods may expose people to dangerous toxins, for example, that were formerly in the sewer system. Now, damage to property may also have direct effects on people. Those who may lose their homes in extreme weather events, and those, especially, again, we talked about those who have lower incomes, they may be disproportionately affected because they cannot afford to move anywhere else or buy another home. Now, damage to infrastructure and environment may sever support lines for those in need. Infrastructure damage like healthcare and emergency response services will have a direct effect on the care that people can be provided with, especially dealing with these extreme weather events. Now, long-term effects also may occur, such as chronic medical complications and lowered productivity of workers, and of course, you have increased rate of stillborn babies because of increased stress caused by these events. Now, biodiversity is also biodiversity loss is also a potential effect of climate change. Decline in biodiversity has the potential to cause change in food availability. Pollinator loss may affect vastly more species than the pollinator species because the species that is pollinated may be a food species for other consumers. Depletion of fisheries may have an impact on food availability, depending on the type of fish that is being consumed. They may have a direct impact on food availability for humans, but also decrease in certain species of fish may also effectively cause a change in the food chain so that other species that we humans may eat can be affected as well. Now, ocean acidification is also an effect of climate change, specifically of the global warming. It can promote bacterial blooms. These are bursts of growth in bacteria. These can take up light and nutrients from other organisms, having effects on food chains yet again. And ocean acidification can also disrupt the carbon pump system in oceans. What this is this naturally formed system by which phytoplankton absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. What happens to these phytoplankton is they absorb CO2 that is dissolved from the atmosphere into the ocean surface, and they sink to the bottom of the ocean, removing carbon from the carbon cycle. However, due to ocean acidification, some of these phytoplankton, the lighter ones that do not sink as quickly, are favored by selection, thus keeping carbon closer to the atmosphere and removing less of it from the carbon cycle. May alter marine food webs and food availability because acidic conditions may kill off certain organisms, and these organisms may play a key role in food webs depending on by what they are consumed. Now, climate change may affect the ocean by acidifying it, and you can see that the sea level will rise due to increased temperature. Coral reefs will be experience bleaching. This is because the symbiotic relationship between the coral and the colorful part of the coral, a microorganism, is disrupted. Algae blooms may, again, disrupt nutrients and light from other organisms, etc. And here are citations that we used to form this presentation. That is all.
Nice. What an informative presentation. So hi, my name is Luke Zhao. I'm one of the founding members and organizers of today's events. And I'll be helping to guide the conference along pretty smoothly, I hope. So if you have any questions to ask either Charles or Bowen, go ahead and ask them. You can either do so in the chat or you can unmute yourself. If you don't have any burning questions, we'll go ahead and take this time to relax and recharge, and we'll be starting our next presentation shortly. So again, if you have any questions, you can use the chat or unmute yourself to go ask them.
Hi, Charles. Thank you for your presentation. It was very informative. I learned a lot. I actually had a question regarding your slides on biodiversity. So, you talk a lot about how climate change can obviously affect the biodiversity of our oceans through ocean acidification, things like that. But can you elaborate more on how this loss of biodiversity will immediately affect the human population?
Right. So one of the more important things to remember is that uh, various species in the ocean do not exist in this vacuum state. Species, any given species may have a number of interactions with another group of species. Now, a lot of these are predatory. The most important is predatory. So let's say you have a population of a primary producer. So this is often like krill. If you um, create the conditions so that krill is not as effective at reproducing, this can occur due to acidification. You're going to have a decrease in the krill population. Now, if this was on its own, this wouldn't be so bad. Humans don't eat krill. However, there are a number of other species that do eat krill, and these decreases in the populations of these species may have a direct effect up the chain on human consumption.
Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, Charles, can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yes.
Thanks for a great presentation. I'm just curious. I'm not in the area about the climate change, but I'm just curious about what is any evidence to prove that the snow storm or this area got impacted. It is really caused by the global warming in the northern pole. So what is the theory and what are the convincing evidence to prove that?
Bowen, would you like to answer this one?
Yeah, sure. So as I've stated in my presentation, there's a jet stream that keeps cold air in the northern hemisphere. I believe it's called the Arctic jet stream. I'm not sure the exact name, but if you search up the Arctic jet stream, you should be able to get more information about that. But to put it concisely, the Arctic jet stream, there's warming in that area, which causes the jet stream to weaken and allow freezing air to drift down to lower latitudes, which is why Texas kind of got this unprecedented snowstorm. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, for your presentation. You talked about phytoplankton removing carbon from the cycle. How does this lead to ocean acidification?
It's more of an effect of ocean acidification rather than a cause of it, because ocean acidification acts as a selective pressure for plankton that do not perform the carbon pump cycle as effectively as the plankton that.
Thank you.
Okay, so seeing that no one else has questions, we will move forward with our presentations. So up next, we have Selena and Cindy presenting on climate governmental policies around the world.
All right, thank you. Can everybody see the shared screen? Okay, great. So again, thank you guys for coming today. A quick introduction. Hi, I'm Cindy, a CCTF officer and sophomore from Arcadia High School in LA, California.
Hi, I'm Selena, CCF officer, a sophomore from Yorba Linda High School in Orange, California. We'll be presenting on current government climate policies in nations around the world, including the US, the European Union, Kenya, India, and China, and how they impact the fight against climate change.
All right, to begin with, in the United States, as many of you may have seen on the news or even experienced yourself, there have been record-setting wildfires and one of the most active hurricane seasons in 2020. As we speak right now, Texas is facing the aftermath of a severe winter storm. So as Bowen and Charles explained, these natural disasters are becoming more common and severe, and they're all connected to a changing climate in America. All right, so what exactly is the United States planning to do for climate change mitigation? Today, I'll be discussing the new Biden administration's plan moving forward. Okay, and President Biden has stated that he and his climate team are aiming to create concrete, actionable policies that create jobs, mitigate climate change, and put our nation on the road to net zero emissions no later than 2050. So it's clear here that he's putting climate change one of his top priorities. And considering that US, just one country, emissions, these policies are going to profoundly impact our ability to avert the worst effects of climate change. Before discussing his long-term plans, I would actually take a look at what he has already done on his first day in office. So one of the most impactful actions was him rejoining the Paris Agreement. And a quick summary, the Paris Agreement is a 189 country alliance that sets out a global plan to avoid very dangerous climate change, and they aim to limit global warming below 2 degrees Celsius.
Hey,
In similar
sorry,
terms,
Cindy. I think Luke, the person who was sharing your screen, is having technical difficulties. So if you could share your screen instead, that would be great.
okay, yeah. Let me do that. All right, are we all good?
Yeah.
Okay. So as I was saying, the Paris Agreement sets out a global plan and it has 189 countries in it. So it really is just a coalition of countries trying to help out one another in their effects of climate change. And President Trump withdrew from this agreement in 2019. However, Joe Biden recently just signed a legislator so that America is back in this agreement, which is a crucial first step in our fight for the environment. All right, second, President Joe Biden also reversed a lot of President Trump's rollbacks. So during his presidency, President Trump rolled back many environmental regulations. For example, he lifted oil and natural gas extraction bans. He replaced the Clean Power Plan, and he revised mercury and air toxic standards. So the new administration is actually examining and taking action against these rollbacks. They're also considering revising fuel and methane standards in hopes to cut pollution. And lastly, they also revoked many project permits that were harmful to the environment. And if we look at an example of that here, the Keystone XL pipeline was a proposed project that President So he gave the company owned by TC Energy was going to be carrying 510,000 barrels of crude oil per day from Kansas all the way to Canada. So if this had been completed, it would have released tens of millions of CO2 emissions potentially if these fossil fuels had been burned. However, President Joe Biden on his first day revoked this permit. And on the picture on the right, you can see a short segment of this Keystone XL pipeline, and it has a lot of detrimental effects on the environment. All right, so if you guys had noticed, a lot of his first day actions were based off of revoking the previous administrations. So what does Joe Biden himself have for his climate vision? Well, by 2030, he aims to conserve 30% of America's land and water, hoping to preserve biodiversity, which Charles explained in our previous presentation was really important for humans as well. He also plans to implement 500,000 electric vehicle outlets. So hopefully that would promote cleaner energy. By 2035, he aims to reduce carbon footprint from US buildings, including our homes. So he will be working with the Urban Housing Department, trying to implement cleaner energy and electricity for our homes. And by 2050, this is his ultimate goal. He wants to have a 100% clean energy electricity America with net zero emissions. And as we can see in this graph here, it is clearly a very, very lofty goal. Within 18 years, the US was able to increase clean electricity by only 10%, but President Joe Biden aims to have a 100% clean America by 2050. All right, and next, Selena will be talking to you more about other countries.
Other countries aside the United States also face many challenges related to climate change and have had many policies of the topic. First up was like the European Union. The circular economy was a policy adopted by the European Union in 2019 aimed to reduce waste. The left model here shows the waste being displaced in a traditional environment where waste discarded directly impacts sea, air, drinking water, and soil. These displacements directly damage our environment and cause problems such as temperature change that increases climate change. The policy of the circular economy is put into effect to abolish these harms. A circular economy, as the one shown in the right, is a lot more efficient. The policy promotes countries within the European Union to and to save the old theory of renew, reuse, and recycle to re-inject waste back into the economy. The implementation of these recent policies in the European Union, such as the circular economy, are crucial in considering how to limit non-recyclable waste. It is currently used effectively in many EU states. Next slide, please. The European Union's goal by 2030 the Europeans' goal by 2030 was to cut overall greenhouse emissions by at least 40% compared to 30 years ago in 1990. This was a goal put in place to show the EU's climate ambitions and as required in the Paris Agreement. If this goal is realized, then the citizens in the EU will receive more job opportunities, have a better economy, and of course, receive health benefits by a better environment.
Okay, so now moving on to some rapidly developing countries. So we're going to be talking about Kenya, and Kenya in particular is susceptible to climate change because it is such an agrarian society that depends highly on agriculture. So as you can see in these photos, they're already experiencing longer droughts, heat waves, unpredictable rainfall, flooding right here, and overall increased temperatures, which has had a negative effect on their economy and agriculture. To add on, they already have some existing environmental issues, such as water security, food security, and economic growth. So to give a brief summary of this country's climate change policies, they implemented a National Climate Change Action Plan in 2018, which was based off a previous plan. And I think the main difference here between Kenya and other countries, as you can see in the aim, I bolded this word adaptation because Kenya actually is trying to achieve climate change mitigation, not mitigation, but adaptation. And this is quite different from like the US or the EU, because we are so focused on cleaner energy and trying to avoid it as a whole, while Kenya is trying to adapt by helping people cope with droughts, flooding, and ensuring crop productivity even with the changing climate. And this approach to fighting climate change, it's suitable for a country like Kenya because they're only responsible for less than 1% of global emissions, but it might not be suitable for countries with larger emissions like the US or China. All right, and Selena, we'll take it away from here.
Okay, thank you. So another country that's actually similar to Kenya, as Cindy discussed earlier, is India. There's many reasons that make India a country especially vulnerable to the dangers of climate change. The small farms and plantations reside by the oceans. However, in the past few years, India had a significant increase in temperature that caused floods, as shown in the two pictures on the left, that destroyed countless homes and farms. Moreover, 2,400 Indians from 2018 to 2019 died because of climate issues, and there is a possibility that India's GDP per capita will shrink by 10% in 2050 due to climate change. India currently uses a mix of different energy methods. However, the predominant leading source of energy is coal, which its emissions cause terrible air pollution, resulting in diseases such as cancer, lung disease, asthma, and many more harmful impacts, as discussed in our earlier presentation. The Indian government in recent years have been trying to limit their coal consumption and are moving towards more sustainable energy resources, such as using wind and biomass. However, the increasing demand for energy due to developments in technology, infrastructure, and the increase in population causes the use of coal to be an inevitable result. Now we will see some policies initiated by the Indian government to solve this issue. The Indian government issued the National Action Plan on Climate Change on June 30th, 2008. This mainly focused on controlling carbon emissions, which is caused by burning coal. The goal was to keep India's carbon emissions below the average of all developed countries at all times. This plan also set a goal for a 20% improvement in water use efficiency through pricing and other measures. Purified water will thus make people's living conditions better and the life expectancy will increase. Secondly, the intended nationally determined commitments was initiated on October 2, 2015 in the Paris Agreement. The main purpose was to cut emissions operating in a 5-year cycle and build a good habit for future regulations. Another country especially notable in climate change issues is China. China, along with the United States and India, cause more than 50% of all the greenhouse emissions on the planet. In addition, China is also the largest renewable energy producer. The largest power plants in the world are predominantly found in China, and the coal in China is a major source for global warming. The Chinese government, as the first developing country to publish a national strategy for global warming, was actually really attached to and made some effective changes in the issues of climate change, as you can see from this drastic decrease in coal consumption in the past 2 decades. China put in place many climate change policies, including the industrial energy efficiency and restoration policy. China initiated to peak the CO2 emissions by at least by the 2030s and increase the use of non-fossil fuel energy carriers. This policy, part intensity in the country. Following that, the National Plan on Climate Change, published on June 7, 2007, set a goal to reduce greenhouse gases by 1.5 million tons using methods such as increasing the use of renewable energy and increasing efficiency in coal-fired power stations. In conclusion, although there might not seem like a direct impact of other countries' policies or even our own state's policies over our everyday life, there are actually countless ties between every aspect. In general, the majority of the countries in the world are now making efforts to lower the impact of climate change. However, there are still many countries who have emissions high above the healthy standards. Many of these countries lack an efficient system to control climate change or do not have any policy at all for climate change control. Thus, it is up to us ordinary citizens to get more people aware of the dangers of this serious topic. Every small step can make a big impact. Here are some things we can do.
Yeah, so often a lot of government policies are out of our hands, but what we can do at home, especially during this pandemic, is things like read and signing petitions, spreading awareness like we are now. So thank you guys for coming. Also protesting or having online activism. And these will all pressure our government to take real action. Also, if possible, fuel efficient vehicles are best for our environment as they don't depend on crude oil. Also, investing in energy efficient appliances at home would really make a big difference. So yeah, that's all we have for today. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice presentation. So again, if you guys have any questions you would like to ask either Cindy or Selena, go ahead and ask them either through the chat or by unmuting yourself. If you don't have any questions, you can go ahead and take this time to relax, and we'll start our next presentation after a short break. I'll start us off actually. I have a quick question. So Cindy, you talked a bit about the kind of two different approaches that certain countries took to combating climate change. I'm particularly interested in the one that Kenya did, adaptation. What is your opinion on whether or not first world countries like the US or other like the European Union, for instance, what is your opinion on them using adaptation?
Great question. I think for these types of countries that you mentioned, adaptation is not only probably not going to be that much effective, but it's also going to be detrimental because it's usually these countries that are contributing to global emissions the most. So for example, in the US, if all we did was adaptation, then if anything, our very effective. So I think for Kenya, however, the way they're approaching this would actually be helpful for both citizens in Kenya and internationally as well.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. You can go.
Okay. So I actually have a question for Cindy as well. You talked about, I believe one of your graphs showed the Biden's plans, his ambitious goals for 2050 to be 100% clean electricity. And you also talked about like how he is doing this through things like the Keystone Pipeline. But there was a lot of news about how a lot of controversy about how like removing that Keystone Pipeline like unemployed many of those high skilled workers that were required for that pipeline. So what is your opinion on kind of like a balance between preserving the environment and also like preserving the economy as well?
Yeah, so there definitely was a lot of controversy with the Keystone Pipeline. Economically, it will take some jobs away from those workers. But another way to look at it is that by focusing on a clean energy sector, that in itself will increase jobs by millions. So it is like you have to invest some kind of like negative, but in the end, there will be more jobs for the clean energy sector that not only will benefit workers, but also be good for our environment as well. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. That was very interesting to learn about other countries' policies because I predominantly focus on the US. But I just wanted to, I was curious if you could talk about, if you knew anything about um, Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Strong Green New Deal plan, which is another one in the US. That's a set of policies. If you like are you familiar with it, slash like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so the Green New Deal's heavily supported by Bernie Sanders and AOC. I think that one comes with much more controversy because it also ties in like the economy, environmental justice as well. I think Joe Biden's plan is more of just like focusing things from a clean energy sector. But honestly, I'm not really an expert in the Green New Deal, but I definitely would like to research that more. If anybody else has anything to add.
I am part of Sunrise Cincinnati, which obviously Sunrise is a huge, you know, supporter of the Green New Deal. They basically created it. And
yeah.
are you, Maddie, are you also part of Sunrise?
Yeah, I'm part of National, and then I work for.
I'm part of Sunrise too.
Awesome.
Oh, I got some Sunrisers here. I guess, I mean, you probably know a lot about it, but I was just gonna say that I think the Green New Deal is a lot like the New Deal. So it's trying to basically create in a way, like a whole new American economy, you know, like kind of rebuilding it from the ground up. And I think Biden's plan is almost just like a smaller scale version of that, and then also just more focusing on that clean energy sector as well.
Thank you. That was nice to learn.
Yeah, so like, thank you for participating and speaking up. So yeah, we do have a lot of global audience in our Zoom meeting today. So if any of our participants are from other countries, like if you would like to share your country's policies and whether or not they are effective, that would be greatly appreciated. So we highly urge you to do that. So if anyone wants to share, here is your time.
All right, so if there are no more questions, we'll go on with our next presentation. So our next presentation will be titled Mutual Aid in the Climate Crisis Movement, and will feature Maddie Hedgepeth from Sunrise Montclair. So without further ado, please take it away.
Alrighty. 1 second. Okay, so my name is Maddie Hedgepeth. I'm a climate and social justice activist from northern New Jersey, actually, so I'm from the Northeast Coast. I currently lead a group called Sunrise Montclair, and I'm also the actions director for Extinction Rebellion Youth New Jersey, along with a bunch of other organizations in the coast. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what mutual aid is and how that's kind of relevant in the climate world. Please stop or type in the chat if you have any questions. Yeah, so let's get started. So to start off with mutual aid, the first thing we must recognize is the extent of the climate crisis. Contrary to some beliefs, it absolutely affects everyone. It impacts those living along the coastlines as the water levels continue to rise. It affects those who live in cities as the air gets dirtier and less safe. And the climate crisis disproportionately affects people of color, indigenous folks, people living at or below the poverty line, immigrants, women, queer people, the disabled, the homeless, and neurodivergent people. It affects the systems that countries are built upon entirely, especially the US's current systems that we have. So the most important thing to recognize when talking about the climate crisis is who it's affecting, which is everyone. So when we talk about mutual aid, people often get confused as to what that means and how it's different from charity. The overarching principles are different. As you look closer, they have significant differences. So when we say charity, or when people talk about donating to a charity, they're often referring to nonprofits, either monetarily or by donating items like to hospitals like St. Jude's. They usually don't expect to receive money back or items back, although sometimes tax cuts, like if you donate items to like the Salvation Army, but that doesn't fall under mutual aid. Charity is the concept of giving back without the expectation of reciprocity. On the opposite side, when people participate in mutual aid efforts, often like cooking meals for someone in the community or pooling money to help someone out, this is done under the pretense that if you need help with money or food, whether currently or in the future, your community would do the same, and they would do what they could do to help you out. Mutual aid focuses around the principles that you give what you can, whether that be money, time, food, etc. And then when time comes for you to need help with something entirely different, you'll be supported by your community in the way that makes the most sense for them to help. So going into a deeper dive on the principles of mutual aid, there are multiple areas in which the concept applies. First one, obviously being aid in the form of housing, medical care, food, and disaster relief, especially right now. An example you can look at is in Texas, where they are running out of power, out of food, and it's disproportionately affecting communities with less money, people of color, and the people with disabilities or who are immunocompromised, especially during the global pandemic. You can also look at mutual aid in the global pandemic itself and like the homeless population and how COVID-19 is affecting them. And then you can look back to the summer last year, when the riots in Minnesota occurred, and then you can look at the mutual aid efforts between people helping out people in jail, etc. A common slogan in the efforts is solidarity, not charity, emphasizing the differences between the two. We stand together and help each other as a group instead of as individuals. Another main principle is working together to figure out strategies and resources to meet each other's needs and figuring out who can help provide what and kind of putting that into baskets. So when something happens, we know who to look to for certain resources. The last major portion of mutual aid is opposing the systems that created the shortage in the first place. This is often capitalism or sub-institutions of capitalism, such as racism, xenophobia, homeless architecture, and lack of jobs and housing available. Jobs is a common example of a capitalism sub-institution, limited by requirements that are often hard to attain for working people, such as college degrees or prior work or skill experience. So where does the climate crisis intersect with the purpose and the values of mutual aid efforts? Climate change is responsible for people losing their houses, for people losing their jobs, for resorting to minimum wage work, for food shortages, for irregular weather and natural disasters, for decreased mental health, for the extinction of species, and so much more. Mutual aid efforts can aid in some of these crises, whether providing temporary or permanent housing or food supplies, or testing for the safety of water conditions, helping to find jobs, providing relief post-natural disasters, and providing support to marginalized communities. Mutual aid helps heal some of the injuries caused by the climate crisis, preparing society to move forward in a more climate-conscious world by making the future accessible to all. Without mutual aid in the climate crisis, you cannot continue to step forward. A lot of the activists who shut down the Keystone XL pipeline, for example, were focusing on the areas that the Keystone pipeline was affecting, not just environmentally, but also through like the indigenous people's land it was running through. For example, Wounded Knee, South Dakota, which is right at the bottom of South Dakota, which a major portion of the pipeline was running through. And it was affecting the air quality, it was affecting the jobs available and the housing spaces, as well as the actual reservation itself, which is theoretically protected, but not treated that way necessarily. So a lot of climate activists and mutual aid workers, they look to see just how the climate is also impacting and how mutual aid can help to change those who are being impacted by it. To come into a more climate conscious world, you have to be prepared to make sacrifices, but also to help other people. We currently live in such a capitalistic society that focuses on benefiting only ourselves. And of course, there are people and there are groups that are made to benefit others, even under capitalism. And there's no conscious consumption under capitalism, but we have to continue to try and work together and helping each other out to move past that and continue into a more climate conscious world. A big question people tend to ask is how to bring mutual aid into your current work. So if you're focusing on just CO2 emissions, how are you going to bring that into what you do? If you're focusing on toxic waste plants, what are you going to do to help the people around you? So there's several options here. You can consider forming coalitions with other climate orgs, no matter if the focus is the same or not in the area, and working together to form a network to help each other with things. So whether that's exchanging speakers, exchanging information with each other to continue to educate, providing support at calls or events you're hosting, etc. The list goes on. You could also locate pre-existing mutual aid networks and efforts and add on to what's already there. For example, in my town, there's something called Montclair Mutual Aid, which focuses on helping the community, but right now it's more about we have illegal immigrants and we're working on finding them housing until the pandemic is over and it's safe to get green cards. So another option is to reach out to folks in your area to see what they need help with. So kind of creating your own effort. And it doesn't have to be serious. It obviously doesn't need a title. It's just mutual aid. And that's like the most amazing part about it is that mutual aid is constant and doesn't need one specific set of rules. It's flexible. Cross-state work is also super cool. If you wanted to do my hub, Sunrise Montclair, we just finished part of our mutual aid efforts for the year, which is, or for last year actually, but we finished a little late, was collecting donations for the Lakota Reservation, South Dakota and Wounded Knee. We have a contact out there, and because the way we treated the mutual aid was we collected all these donations, we ended up sending, I think it was close to 1,000 pounds of donations from Montclair, and then more through Amazon. And then they, in turn, they have clay out there that they make beads out of, and it's really beautiful. And so they sent some to us to sell to help us fundraise for another group in our town. So it's kind of all interconnected, and it's super cool, and you get to learn a lot of things. And one day in the future, if we need help with something else, like a speaker, we can rely on them, know that we can go to them and be like, hey, can you help us out with this? So that is something that we've done. And there are many options to expand upon. And if you want brainstorming ideas, reach out to me. Don't worry about it. Yeah, so there's lots of different things you can do. So Peter Kropotkin once said, man is a result of both his inherited instincts and his education. Among the miners and the seamen, their common occupations and their everyday contact with one another create a feeling of solidarity, while the surrounding dangers maintain courage and pluck. In the cities, on the contrary, the absence of common interest nurtures indifference, while courage and pluck, which seldom find their opportunities, disappear or take another direction. So he's kind of summarizing solidarity and mutual aid in the sense that when you don't have to be the same and you don't have to need the same things, but you can rely on each other. Okay. Ooh. Sorry. Okay. So here's some resources to learn more about mutual aid if you found this interesting. I will give you a minute to maybe stop a picture, write some of them down. The first two books, Mutual Aid, A Fact of Revolution, and the author is Peter Kropotkin, whose quote I just read, super interesting, and Undoing Border Imperialism is also a super great book I recommend. On the websites, I'll list about the principles and different ways to incorporate that into your life if that so interests you. So yeah, I'll give you a minute.
I have a question. It's a very brief one. Um, could you define what was meant in the quote pluck as a noun? Because I've only heard it as a verb. Is that supposed to mean boldness?
Yeah, it's like courage and pluck in his terms. He's meaning like the concepts of solidarity, which is courage, and then like pluck in the sense is like togetherness, because you pluck
Mhm.
things from a crowd, and so it's
Oh,
kind of that relation.
thank
If
you.
that makes sense. Sorry. Alrighty. And then thank you very much for listening. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to me. Or you can, I guess, you can ask now.
Yeah, so it looks like a really great presentation. If you have any questions for Maddie, go ahead and ask her, either in the chat again or by unmuting as Noel just did. If you don't have any questions, then take this time to relax for a bit and we'll start our next presentation uh, in a bit.
I have a question. That was a really cool presentation and I learned a lot. I hadn't really thought about mutual aid that much and the difference between mutual aid and charity. So we all know what happened in Texas kind of this past week. And to what extent would you say that Texas kind of utilized the benefits of mutual aid?
So I'm not sure how much everyone knows about what's happening in Texas or some of the efforts actually going on in Texas. One example about mutual aid we could talk about in regards to Texas are there's about 8 major mutual aid networks in Texas that focused on doing phone banking for like seniors who needed to find local warming centers. And then places like Sunrise National provided, what we did was we sent like crews of snowplows down to Texas to try and clear some of the roads from neighboring states because Texas doesn't have the infrastructure um, for obviously to deal with snow. I'm actually from Arkansas, and I remember about 10 years ago, we got the most snow the state has ever seen. We got 6 feet, and I was out of school for 2 months because it wouldn't melt. And so like that's just an example of like people bringing in other things to help and like kind of how crazy it is because these people have so much snow and it's not even just the snow, it's the energy froze over, the natural gas pipelines froze, which was predictable seeing as the Texas like people in charge chose not to update the contract 4 years ago and not to redo the pipelines and instead well, they did a couple things instead that weren't really related. But anyway, mutual aid in Texas is kind of allowed now each day than we were at the beginning. Although infantile deaths due to pregnancies and being born have increased as it's gotten colder still. But mutual aid has kind of helped to alleviate food problems, heat issues, and kind of focus on the minorities in the state versus the big cities. That makes sense. Sorry, that was a really long
Thank
explanation.
you. No, that was great. Thank you.
Could you repeat how Sunrise National intervened? I know I caught clean roads, but was it
So
after
Sunrise National essentially sent snowplows
Uh-huh.
from neighboring states like Missouri down to that already had the pre-existing infrastructure down to Texas,
Thank you.
which is really cool. Expensive, but really cool. Anything else?
Yeah, hi Maddie. Thank you so much for your presentation. I actually wanted to just bring up one of the posts in the chat. So Oscar and Frederick put out that, hi, we come from Denmark. Bernie Sanders has often used Denmark as a good example for how to combat the climate change. For example, our windmill production. However, sadly, there's a lot of greenwashing here in Denmark by our government. For example, we have a plan of reaching a 70% carbon dioxide reduction within 2030, but the government wants to accomplish this with future technology, more electric cars and power to X, which won't make us reach our goal. So I'm bringing us up to ask you, like, do you have any ideas and opinions about this problem of greenwashing, and also what do you see in the future technology and how that will combat climate change?
So Bernie Sanders, he's a big portion of my movement and what I've done, in especially during the pandemic and regarding the election. That's kind of which some of my organizations focused on. Yes, greenwashing is a huge problem in all countries. You can see it in the US, Denmark. I've actually been to Denmark. It's also a big thing. You see all these signs, and there's not actually any sustenance behind it. So in the US, you might see examples of like companies saying it's recyclable, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't matter if things are like recyclable if people aren't recycling. And so a lot of times greenwashing is like, you see like small things happening and you're like, oh, that's great. And you are encouraged to do things, but they don't actually follow through to make sure things happen. And therefore we don't do anything for the environment. Regarding the 70% CO2 reduction, Bernie Sanders, often when he uses Denmark, he's talking about the system that's in place, not specifically what's going on, but like what the ideal is, instead of what they're actually doing. So often he has actually referenced like what they're doing. Future technology, such as more electric cars, has problems in, which is kind of where Bernie's focusing on and looking forward to for the US. But there are not enough solutions to exist to meet that mark in Denmark, although the US has other ideas, we just haven't worked towards them. Regarding future technology, in the US at least, or across the nation, I'm a big believer in it's the result of several companies that need more regulation. Not even necessarily more regulation, but like Biden gave out 37 fracking permits within his first month, which people are so kind of blindly looking at what he's done so far as like so great. And he's done a lot of good things for the climate, but he's kind of counteracting them under the table a little bit with these fracking permits, which is really bad for the ocean. It is related to heating up the ocean itself. So like there's good and bads to every side. Future technology, you could look at solar panels and windmills and hydropower dams, but they all have negative side effects. So there's this thing that they looked at in, I think they're testing in Iceland, is where it's like forcing carbon down into the earth, which then solidifies into some different materials. And it's kind of a heavy process, but it reduces mass amounts of carbon at once. And because carbon solidifies down with enough pressure, it's a good way to reduce carbon. And I know that the US is currently looking at that and testing it in Iceland. So that's one future technology that I'm kind of excited about. Yeah. And then Charlotte says, is it easier for a small organization to get involved with mutual aid locally or by joining already established larger state-wide programs? It really depends on where you're located. So if your state has a lot or country has a lot of programs that exist, it might be easier to get local, or it depends on how many people you have, or you can look at larger statewide programs, or you can do a mix of both. So like I work with ones that in my town and then also my state, and I work across the country. I work with actually, California has a mutual aid network, CNA, that is super great, and we go back and forth. So like you can really choose, it depends. If you want help finding one, just let me know because I have a whole list of them. But yeah. Anything else? Awesome. Thank you all.
All right, yeah. Thank you, Maddie. So if nobody else has any more questions, we'll get how to avoid a climate change disaster, and it'll feature Edmund Yu from the Climate Change Task Force. So without further ado, please take it away.
All right, guys. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edmund Yu. I'm currently a junior attending Diamond Bar High School in Southern California, and I am also one of the leaders and co-founders of the Climate Change Task Force. So during this conference, our amazing speakers have already presented on current approaches to address climate change, pinpointing governmental action in the world's biggest countries, along with mutual aid. So in this last presentation, we'll be shifting our focus from what we are doing in the status quo to future counteractive measures the world can take in an attempt to save our planet. Thus, our final topic is technology, the key to avoiding a climate change disaster. The first topic I will be discussing today relates to the environmental impact of large business corporations. The growth of the economy is undoubtedly correlated with the health of the environment. For example, a 2017 study cited in an article from The Guardian states that just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions. When hearing this statistic, it is obvious that the economy currently harms the planet tremendously, particularly through the release of greenhouse gas emissions. This pretty much confirms what we already knew regarding the effects of big business. However, the future is not as grim as it seems. As you all may know, in the past few months, the value of Tesla, an American electric vehicle and clean energy company, has grown unprecedentedly. Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla, has one of the two highest net worths in the world, comparable only to Amazon's Jeff Bezos. Now, why is Tesla's growth notable? Tesla's recent rise in value illustrates that private investors believe in a company that focuses on benefiting the environment instead of harming it. The mission statement of Tesla is to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. This company is a perfect example of how the economy and the environment can benefit simultaneously. Along with the creation of businesses with environmental initiative, entrepreneurs can also promote action against climate change through philanthropy. Today, we will be focusing specifically on the innovative entrepreneur and one of the two founders of Microsoft, Bill Gates. Founding his company in 1975, Bill Gates turned Microsoft into one of the biggest corporations in the world. Nowadays, he spends almost all his time expanding the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a philanthropic organization that has donated over $45 billion to charitable causes. Bill Gates is a notable figure at our conference today because he has recently released a book on the necessity of combating climate change and Gates has expressed his concerns for the environment through both his words and his actions. According to Gates himself, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has donated over $1 billion to promising companies developing energy sustainability technology. Also, from the Global Commission on Adaptation, Gates has committed $310 million to climate adaptation action, a term that describes efforts to mitigate impacts of climate change on the human population. So as you can clearly see, Bill Gates has been involved with the movement against climate change through, again, both his words and actions. A quote from Bill Gates is shown on the slide. Gates stated that in order to understand the kind of damage that climate change will inflict, look at COVID-19 and spread the pain out over a much longer period. Gates wisely relates climate change to the current pandemic we are in to illustrate the enormity of the situation. Obviously, the impacts of global warming are not as easily visualized as the deaths and illness directly correlated with the coronavirus right now. However, Gates is saying that as time goes on and the Earth keeps getting hotter and hotter, the impacts of climate change will be just as, if not more prevalent. Now, let's elaborate on some of these detrimental effects. We have all heard how climate change is reducing our Earth's biodiversity. You can remember our very first presentation today, where Charles talked about the loss of biodiversity through ocean acidification. The most common example of this is the shrinking of the Arctic polar bear population as well. However, Bill Gates decides to focus his attention more on climate change's effects on the human population. In his book, Gates elaborates on his changing mindset regarding his foundation spending. Before 2015, Gates devoted almost all his time and money to what he believed were more urgent global issues, such as food security and the development in the poorest countries in the world. But as he met with more and more climate scientists and discovered the immediacy of climate change, Gates started heavily investing in companies aiming at solving this problem. Gates even sold all his shares in oil, gas, and other fossil fuel companies. And his reasoning behind this decision was because climate change is related to all the problems his foundation aimed to solve. Food insecurity is growing due to the inability of farmers to adjust to a hotter climate. Also, the Brookings Institution states that over 68 million people were forcibly displaced from their homes in 2017, the most in human history. We can link these global issues to the one thing that connects them both: global warming. Here is another quote from Bill Gates that I would like to share. If we learn the lessons of COVID-19, we can approach climate change more informed about the consequences of inaction. During the world's quarantine, greenhouse gas emissions have decreased about 5%. Gates mentioned this fact in his book. Lowered. Actually, it was how little. It took the deaths of tens of millions of people in different countries around the world just to lower our emissions production by a meager 5%. If the world doesn't act now, emissions levels will go back to the general trend of rising again, marking absolute destruction of the Earth's environment. This brings us to the slide on Bill Gates' new book, released just a few days ago on February 16th. The title is How to Avoid a Climate Disaster: The Solutions We Have and the Breakthroughs We Need. In the next few slides, I'll be going over two main points that are the foundation of what Gates writes about. But despite these 2 points, there are many more lessons from the book to not like there are too many lessons from the book to cover in my presentation today. That's why I highly recommend that you give this book a read whenever you can. You will gain a tremendous amount of insight into the major action Gates proposes against climate change. Let's move on. The primary point Gates makes regarding the absolute necessity of dealing with climate change can be summed up with four short words: 51 billion to zero. The numbers in this phrase refer to the tons of greenhouse gas emissions emitted per year into the atmosphere. Throughout the entirety of his book, Gates brings up this point multiple times and declares that we must reach a net total of zero emissions. He uses an analogy to explain why. Imagine the atmosphere as a bathtub and greenhouse gases as the water in the bathtub. If you keep adding water to a bathtub, eventually the water will overflow and spill out. In climate change terms, this event marks the tipping point where environmental damage becomes irreversible. Even if you reduce the flow of water into the bathtub, the level of water is still increasing at a gradual rate. The only way around this problem is to drain some of the water out of the bathtub or directly remove greenhouse gases from our atmosphere through new technology. Carbon dioxide emissions remain in the atmosphere for a long time, meaning that natural processes cannot be solely relied upon. So this brings us to Bill Gates' 3-point strategy of combating climate change. The first, again, is to recognize the importance of going from 51 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions to zero. In the process, humans will have to adapt to and mitigate the harms that climate change has already brought upon our planet. The second step in Gates' strategy is to deploy current tools such as solar and wind energy, which will be discussed later, to create more sustainability. In order to elevate the effectiveness of these renewable energy sources, we must develop them in a way that makes them cheaper, that makes these alternatives cheaper than fossil fuels. In this way, businesses and individuals will have absolutely no incentive to use fossil fuels, as they would be harmful to the environment and more expensive. Finally, Gates' last point is to develop new breakthrough technologies. Both innovation. There are still many risks in investing in companies developing renewable energy sources, and the government is the key to minimizing these risks. Corporations and governments around the world must work together to implement these techniques into society. With that being said, what are some of the technologies being used to fight climate change? Are there any technologies being developed right now that could be incredibly useful in the battle against global warming? Lots of research and development is being done in the field of environmental studies, which would result in tons of new technologies and science to use. Here are just a few. One of the most prominent methods of slowing the advancement of climate change is through the usage of renewable energy sources. Many of these renewable energy sources have well-established markets, like for instance, solar panels, which harness the energy from the sun and use catalytic cells placed within the panels to convert sunlight into usable energy. Wind turbines are another way of generating energy from renewable sources, wind in this case. And there are even different locations for the placement of wind turbines. In fact, there's a lot of speculation and hard evidence for the optimal placement of wind turbines in the sea, where so-called floating wind arrays could generate energy from wind offshore. This renewable energy could then be used in batteries for electric vehicles. New development in the creation of more efficient and eco-friendly batteries, including the development of the solid electrolyte interface, had resulted in better technology and energy storage devices, paving the way for a future in which all of our technology could be completely run on renewable energy and highly efficient batteries. There are tons of experimental techniques being developed for the fight against climate change. One of these processes is called power to X, and in a nutshell, it essentially uses electrolyzers to extract hydrogen from water and to use that hydrogen for energy storage instead of carbon-based fossil fuels. If used in the right manner, this could be a powerful tool for developing more environmentally friendly energy storage devices and methods, as it would give us the freedom to leave behind the fossil fuels that are causing so much of the pollution in the atmosphere. Another process that's incredibly important is the use of carbon capture and storage, which is essentially civilization trying to mimic nature's ability to take in carbon-based atmospheric compounds and to either store them underground with biomass plants or to reconvert it into other more useful compounds. In fact, NASA is currently developing an experiment with the Perseverance rover called MOXIE, in which they are attempting to convert the carbon dioxide on Mars' atmosphere into oxygen gas. With technologies like these on the way, the fight against climate change is looking a little bit brighter. That's not all, though. In order to organize and to coordinate all of these climate change fighting technologies, better central planning and communications are needed. And with the development of 5G based smart grids, it seems like the necessary communications are indeed coming. Faster communications and network connections means that data centers and transmission and distribution networks will be able to correspond with and manage more facilities, allowing for better organization of services that could potentially fight back the advancement of climate change. On a more personal level, even the foods we eat can have big impacts on the climate, with industries like the beef industry creating large amounts of methane gas and other greenhouse gases. Being able to substitute these goods for other, more eco-friendly ones would be beneficial, and developments in synthetic meats and foods are making that transition easier for everyone. Synthetic beef is beginning to taste more and more like real beef, and other synthetic foods are very close to their real counterparts. In the future, it's possible that the difference between synthetic food and real food will be so subtle where we might not even know we're eating synthetic food. The advancements I've just talked about are only some of the most prominent ones, but there are tons of other lesser known developments that are just as important as these progressive ideas. So, for example, direct air capture is essentially the filtering of air in order to capture the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and then use it to make fuel or other carbon based products like plastics. Speaking of plastics, several different companies are also using carbon dioxide to fuel the creation of bioplastics by pumping in the carbon dioxide into a more microorganism culture, which produces a material that is eventually turned into bioplastics. Other advancements attack more unorthodox sources of drastic climate change, including cement-free concrete. The idea is that since cement generates around 10% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions, getting rid of the cement in concrete and replacing it with steel slag could make concrete's environmental footprint smaller. Aside from these three, ScopeX is particularly interesting because it's actually an experiment done by Harvard researchers looking to see what the scattering of calcium carbonate particles into the atmosphere would do for the environment. The diagram on the right shows a little more about their predictions and hypotheses of the experiment. So there are many more advancements out there, but this is all I have time for. I hope you all learned a little more about the current state of technological advancement in addressing climate change. And as part of my closing remarks to this presentation, I will be speaking on the Climate Change Task Force call to action. There is currently an unprecedented unity among youth around the world. Since September 2019, climate protests around the world have led to greater awareness of the dangers of climate change. Also, since the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, climate protests have mostly moved online, continuing to bring awareness around the world. Greta Thunberg and other young climate activists are the heroes of our generation. In the next two slides, you can see examples of climate change protests taking place in all forms around the world. And during our quarantine, protesters have adequately switched to online platforms as well. Despite this, one key question remains. Are we even addressing the real problem? Climate protests have some success in changing the climate policies of the EU, the US, and other regions in the world. However, the biggest producer of carbon dioxide emissions by far is currently China, and in the not so distant future, India, the two most populous countries in the world, and both developing at a rapid rate. Climate protest is banned in China, and India may be hostile to climate protests as well. In the upcoming graph, the projected emissions from most major countries are shown. However, China and India are the clear outliers. In the following slides, the articles talk about the constant opposition that climate protesters in China and India face, with students not being allowed education as a consequence. An overwhelming problem about the lack of climate change awareness in China is that China's carbon dioxide production is increasing at an even faster rate. From 2015 to 2018, China's annual carbon dioxide production increased by 2%, and from 2018 to 2019, China's annual carbon dioxide production increased by 3.4%. Despite the pandemic, China's carbon dioxide production in 2020 actually surpassed that in 2019. Earlier on in my speech, I mentioned that the global emissions rate has decreased about 5% due to the pandemic. This is certainly not the case with China. Here are four graphs showcasing China's emissions rate. As you can clearly see, nitrogen oxide and carbon dioxide emission rates in 2020 have slowly crept their way up above the rates of 2019. In the next slide, these are two more graphs comparing the world's global carbon emissions versus China's. It is evident that China's growth in emissions is a clear outlier. What is vastly more alarming is that China's per capita production of carbon dioxide still pales in comparison to the US and the EU. As China continues to develop, its per capita production of carbon dioxide will increase, leading to much greater total production of carbon dioxide. India is also a developing nation that is expected to increase its per capita production of carbon dioxide in the future. This 2018 table illustrates that China is relatively low in per capita emissions compared to the rest of the world, even though it still releases the most emissions in total. What this data means is that there is potential for even more environmental harm as China increases its per capita emissions rate. A key theme of the Climate Change Task Force is unity. Remember, there is only one planet and one atmosphere. The carbon dioxide produced by China and India does not stay in those two countries. It goes into the atmosphere and travels throughout the globe. To combat climate change, we cannot just focus on our own countries and governments, which is very important. We must also devote much of our efforts on China and India. No climate protests in the EU and the US have mentioned China. The carbon dioxide produced by China is not China's problem. It's the problem of the entire humanity. It's time to look past political boundaries and recognize that all of humanity belongs to one species. There are no biological races. That is the real science. So here are some radical proposals for promoting international outreach. Number one, continue to urge your governments to adopt climate-friendly policies. Number two, continue to conduct scientific research on alternative sources of energy besides fossil fuels. And finally, number three, let's try to reach the children and youth in China and spread the message about climate change among them. The Climate Change Task Force has proposed a way to do so, but we need your help. To find out more, please watch the YouTube video of our conference on October 24th in 2020, or the International Day of Climate Action. That is all from me. Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, thank you for presenting. That was a pretty good presentation. So again, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and ask them. using the chat or by unmuting yourself. Both work. And at this time, anybody who would like to just express their ideas and opinions may also do so as well. Go ahead.
Hi, I have a question. Technologies that you had referenced that Bill Gates is a big proponent of. How much of the side effects and the damages of those looked at? They always sound like magic dust that we'll just pump the carbon into the ground and stuff like that. But then, for instance, the pipelines that are needed to pump the carbon are just as dangerous. They have to be built. They destroy communities when they explode. Have you seen one of those when they test explode them? So they always sound like these magic wonders are putting particles into the air. How much is desperation for humanity to find a solution to this causing us to be blind and then doing the same thing again? We just learned how dangerous it is to alter the earth, and now we want to put particles into the air. Like, haven't we learned our lesson? How do you combat, how do you weigh out the negative effects towards, towards what they could potentially bring?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like all technologies that are being developed right now and also will be developed in the future, all of them have harms and all of them have risks. And yeah, carbon sequestration or capture and storage has a lot of risks. Now, that is why like we should focus on we should use those forms of technology that have that kind of risk as a backup plan, or like as you said, it's a lot of desperation. We need to focus instead more on, the renewable energy sources so we can prevent fossil fuels from being used as a source of energy. And in this way, the wind turbines and solar panels, like that will minimize the risk of whatever we can do as human society. That will minimize our risk of developing these new technologies, such as carbon sequestration. So to answer your question, I believe we should prioritize those forms of renewable energy more than these types of putting particles in the atmosphere, as you said. And yeah, I really like that comment. Can't be a little something called a tree. I believe, yeah, like deforestation is a big problem in the world. Like we need to stop like cutting down our trees and letting nature be able to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for us instead of developing these new technologies. But these new technologies are simply a backup plan. We need to like face the problem head on by going against companies who are cutting down our trees and trying to develop new renewable sources of energy that will reduce our fossil fuel usage.
I have a question. So, you talked a lot about different technologies that are trying to, take carbon emissions out of the air or reduce them. But could you elaborate on transportation? Because I think I know a lot of those technologies are kind of already there, but just need to be put in place. But do you have any like examples of that, I guess?
So like, would you be like talking about like, for example, like electrical vehicles? Like, is that what you're saying?
Um, yes, and I guess sort of like public transportation, so like our buses and our subways and stuff like that, because I know a lot of those are already kind of adopting sustainable measures, but like kind of to what extent would that help and to what extent is that already happening, I guess, if
Yeah,
that makes sense.
I am not that familiar with the public transportation or anything like that. But what I can say is that, like having a lot of like these forms of, buses and all of that type like trains and stuff like that where we are traveling together, especially carpooling even, like even as an individual basis, like you can just ride a car with your parents or something like that. That kind of reduces our carbon footprint because we're not traveling by ourselves. We're not driving our own cars. That would basically be like we're polluting the environment less just with our daily forms of action. So yeah, I will definitely do more research onto public transportation in the future, but that is all I have for you. Sorry.
I can speak to
Oh, thank you.
so One of the things like the U.S. is currently focusing on, the U.S. is one of the most heavily reliant countries on cars just because of our vast size, and kind of we're kind of late to the train system setup as the European Union has. So part of our major carbon emissions comes from cars. So the switch over to electrical cars is beneficial, yes, but another thing that the US is kind of looking into, different companies are experimenting with, are electric buses, and changing up the train system to build that a little bit larger, to expand the speed and also like the reduce the emissions produced by a lot of our current like cargo trains and everything. They still run on coal, and that causes a lot of issues, especially because we move a lot of product across the US via coal. So there's a lot of like development in that like sector on focusing on renewable vehicles for like mass transportation.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for answering that question. Someone else put in chat, Victor, how does the climate change task force plan on connecting with the students in China? So yeah, this was actually proposed in about the impact that China has on global emissions due to their unprecedented growth in carbon dioxide emissions and also like, their population, how big it is and how much of an impact they can have. So in order to connect to the students in China, the Climate Change Task Force actually does have these connections. We actually want to offer free tutoring sessions between online tutoring sessions between students in China and students in America or other European countries. So we believe that like this is very important because Chinese students, a lot of the people in China, they still admire like the Western culture. They want to learn European languages, English, all of that stuff. So we believe that these free tutoring sessions and also connecting to Chinese students through being email pen pals and stuff like that, this sort of daily action can promote a type of like culture in China where we can start spreading climate change awareness in that area, because climate change awareness is completely banned in China. And remember, like that protester in that article, she could not go to school because she was protesting climate change. So that is why we believe that we, through like our organization and through a global influence somewhere else besides from within China, we can kind of like develop a formation of an organization within China itself, and that is how we can promote climate change awareness.
All right, so there are no more questions. Thank you guys all for attending the second World Youth Conference on climate change and for making this a memorable experience for all of us. Um, I want to bring up real quick this comment from Oscar and Frederick Briggs Peterson. First and foremost, I really liked your presentation, Edmund. You talked a lot about how technologies is the solution, but what is your opinion on agriculture and primarily the production of meat and dairy as a way of decreasing CO2 emissions? Real quick before we end, Edmund.
Yeah, thank you for your compliments. I believe I mentioned regarding agriculture in my presentation, but a lot of the like agricultural problems is linked to the food chain, because eating vegetation obviously has a lesser environmental impact compared to eating meats, simply because like livestock like cattle, they are a primary consumer, while the vegetation is the primary producers. And as you know, like the trophic levels, each as you go up the trophic levels, the energy transfer is not as efficient. So therefore, we are kind of just taking up more energy and taking up more, like, which will cause more pollution by eating that form of livestock. And remember, the methane emissions from cattle, like that has a huge impact on the environment, because methane, I believe, it is 120 times more damaging to the environment than carbon dioxide. So yeah, agriculture is a huge area that we must like figure out as a society, and like we should promote eating more vegetation rather than those organisms higher up in a food chain.
Yeah, with that being said, We really hope that you've all learned a tremendous amount from this conference and from all of the presentations that have happened today. And we hope that you'll continue to use this knowledge to educate others and to spread more awareness and to ultimately make our environment better, because that is our goal in the long run. As for the Climate Change Task Force, we are planning on holding more conferences in the future and other educational opportunities as well to continue our spread of this climate change awareness around the world. So if you would like updates on our future plans, or you just simply have any questions regarding what we do as an organization, please feel free to contact us via our Twitter at climatechangetf or through our email, theclimatechangetaskforce@gmail.com. So before we end off here, I just want to leave you off on a fairly short note. Climate change, as I'm sure you know, is growing. It's a growing threat. It's an exponentially growing threat, not to just your individual region or state or country, but to this whole entire Earth. And so I strongly urge you to join us in this global movement and to not only unify the world's climate activists and to gain more traction, but to also instill hope within the hearts of many that there will be a better tomorrow. So thank you guys, and we hope to see you again. Take care.
Thank you.